So recording's in progress. You've probably just heard that. So this is going to be recorded. And the project, what it does is it examines the historical roots and lived experience of deindustrialization, as well as political responses to it. So as I said, this is a final in a series of roundtables, but that's been covering the 6 thematic areas that DEPO is looking into. And those areas are the politics of industrial closure, gender and family, race and populism, working class expression, deindustrialization and the environment, and also the politics of industrial heritage. And today's theme is on curating and archiving deindustrialization. So there's potential there to cross-cut across some other areas as well. And we have 4 different sessions, if you like, within this session. So 4 groups of speakers. And without any further ado, I think I'm going to kick off. But before I do so, a little bit of housekeeping. Could you please keep your microphones on mute? That would be really advantageous if you could do so. Please put any comments and questions in the chat. If you think of anything as we're going along, then feel free to put any questions and comments in the chat. And we'll be going through the 4 different presentations in turn, without breaks, without questions, and at the end of each. And then after the presentations, we'll be coming together to have a broader discussion. And so at that point, you can either unmute yourselves, and I'll call on you to speak forth and ask your question or make your comments. And I'll also be keeping an eye on the chat box and going through and attempting to introduce comments and discussants in the right order. So I think that's everything I need to cover. Just check my checklist. And yes, and a really big welcome. So the first 2 speakers is a joint presentation. And we have Rebecca Claire Dolgoy, who's a curator of natural resources and industrial technologies at Ingenium, and that's Canada's Museum of Science and Innovation. And Rebecca is also adjunct research professor in the School of Indigenous and Canadian Studies at Carleton University. And we have to thank her grandmother for allowing her to be here, because her grandmother is actually looking after Teddy, Rebecca's 8-month-old baby. And then Erin Secord is also given the same joint presentation, and she's the manager of conservation services at Ingenium's 3 museums. And Erin is a graduate of Cardiff University, which isn't just down the road from me because I'm based in Swansea. And she's also a graduate of Queen's University in Kingston and has a degree in mechanical engineering. And she's currently involved with a large-scale move of the Ingenium collection to a new purpose-built warehouse. So over to Rebecca and Erin for the first presentation.
Thanks so much, Hilary. Thanks so much, Lauren, Stephen, all of you. It's lovely to see you. It's lovely to take a break from parental leave for a few minutes to just talk about deindustrialization and museums. So thanks for the invitation to participate in today's discussion. I apologize in advance. I'm going to need to leave shortly after my presentation because of family obligations, but I'll leave my contact information in the chat. So if you have any questions or want to reach out, you'll be able to in that manner. So this morning or afternoon, my colleague Erin and I would like to share some thoughts about representing deindustrialization and caring for industrial heritage in the context of our work at Ingenium. 3 museums sit under the wide umbrella of Ingenium, Canada's Museums of Science and Innovation, the Canada Science and Technology Museum, the Canada Aviation and Space Museum, and the Canada Agriculture and Food Museum. You can see pictures of all of our museums in the slide right in front of you, as well as our new conservation center, and Erin will speak about that in a moment. Ingenium is the national corporation charged with looking after a wide variety of Canada's national scientific and technological collections. However, as Erin has noted in some of our discussions, and she'll speak about this in a moment, our collections essentially represent histories of work and labor in Canada, everything from mining and electricity generation to vehicle manufacturing and agricultural and aviation innovations. My own curatorial portfolio, natural resources and industrial technologies, is very, very vast and spans natural resources, water, electricity, energy, mining, metallurgy, industrial and domestic technologies. I am responsible for caring for sewing needles and parts of nuclear reactors. For me, this portfolio may be characterized by the notion of human environmental relations, how humans transform the earth and how the earth transforms human life. There are many examples of material culture embodying deindustrialization that reside in my care.
Hello, and thank you for inviting us. My role at Ingenium is to lead the team of conservation professionals who care for the physical artifacts in the collection. For those of you who may not be familiar with the field, the Canadian Association for the Conservation of Cultural Property describes it as all actions aimed at the safeguarding of cultural heritage for the future. The purpose of conservation is to study, record, retain, and conserve as appropriate the culturally significant qualities of an object with the least possible intervention. Conservation includes examination, documentation, preventive conservation, preservation, restoration, and reconstruction. In the case of Ingenium, the conservation team cares for collections at 3 museums and 2 storage sites. We are currently a team of 18, including conservators, assistant conservators, aircraft maintenance engineers, and conservation specialists in technology. The current focus of this team is to move Ingenium's very large collection of over 100,000 catalog 3D artifacts to a new purpose-built facility across the street. This project started in the fall of 2017, and we are expected to be completely moved in by the summer of 2022.
So both Erin and I, conservation and curatorial work in the Collections and Research Division. I bring this up because there's often a misconception that curators especially only work on exhibitions. So I wanted to say that while we do work on exhibitions, the majority of our collections-based work does not go onto the museum floor. And this is important to note because it helps set the parameters of how we look after the industrial heritage that is in our care and how we curate and conserve deindustrialization. A quick note, though Ingenium does hold a pretty fantastic 2D collection of pertinent archival material, today Erin and I are going to be focusing on the 3D collection. And for the rest of the presentation, we wanted to share some thoughts on both the theory and practice of curating and conserving deindustrialization at Ingenium. We're both going to speak from our vantage point, and then we're going to converge and share our perspectives on a specific case study. So to understand how deindustrialization is represented in the National Collection and cared for by our teams, I need to give you a very brief sketch about how the collection came to be. Though what is now Ingenium, then the National Museum of Science and Technology, opened to the public in 1967, establishing the National Collection predated the opening in the 1950s and 60s. Dr. David Baird, the original museum director, and the curators pursued acquisitions in order to populate the new museum. They certainly acquired some significant pieces that remain the bedrock of the National Collection, but collecting methodologies differed from present-day approaches. Pieces were often collected as representatives of type, and the research files that accompanied the artifact might emphasize how the technology worked rather than the specificities of the particular specimen. At the time, storage space seemed unlimited, and so curators were not always very discriminating. Provenance and human stories, oral histories were not at that time integral to the acquisition process. And unverified rumors persist that people would arrive at work to find objects left outside the storage space by people wishing to donate heirlooms and no longer necessary equipment to the National Collection. And as a result, the earliest part of the collection is quite poorly documented and certainly skews towards proximate representation. Because of the nature of many of the pieces, the weight and size and scale, very few items come from Western or Atlantic Canada. The move from collecting representative types to emphasizing provenance and the multiple sociocultural stories embedded in artifacts began in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And this is now standard curatorial practice today. And today the bar for entry into the National Collection is set incredibly high, and every new artifact comes in with a full research file. It may also be accompanied by interviews or oral histories. And as you can likely deduce, our ability to bear witness and to represent deindustrialization is limited by what was collected and how it was collected. With little provenance and practically no oral histories, the stories we can glean come through close material culture engagement and through careful contextual research. In the summer of 2020, several colleagues and I worked together to develop a new collection development strategy. This strategy is tripartite and follows along the life cycle of an object in our care. It begins with acquisition, which must be informed by research, including oral histories and consultation, demonstrate a high level of significance, be geographically and culturally representative, inclusive, and diverse, and be able to meet standards like authentication and provenance. Our innovation was also to include a set of cultivation principles that outline what happens to the artifact while it is in our care. We aim to promote its accessibility, develop research, explore multi-perspectival interaction, share authority, and collaborate. And finally, we included a set of de-accession principles to round off the story. I mention this because the new guidelines give curators and the administrative tools to pursue ethical and collaborative documentation of deindustrialization and to explore innovative ways to represent deindustrialization in the national collection. And to show the difference between how things were done in the early years and how they will be done moving forward, I wanted to give you an example. And this actually relates to work I've been doing with Petra, who's here today. I just wanted to say hello. So I spent months trying to track down material about one of the show-stopping pieces, early pieces in the collection. It's a green pump jack. You see the photo right here from Saskatchewan. I pursued path after path and met dead end after dead end. The stories of this particular pump jack from the 1950s are just outside of living memory, and it remains quite enigmatic. As a contrast, I'm hoping to do a project on the Athabasca oil sands that will combine oral histories, material culture, and art in the hope of preserving memories and contextualizing the last couple of decades of petroleum production. I mention art as a way of including industrial heritage and processes of deindustrialization in the national collection as one of the possible ways forward. For example, I think I mentioned this at a previous DPOT session. I would love to get an artist up in Sudbury to document the demolition of the superstack. Imagine a play based on oral histories, a 3D or holographic representation or immersive projections in the gallery. And of course, I will also aim to acquire a piece of the superstack because often one emblematic object can embody many histories. But in any case, I do believe that the way to document these processes must involve some sort of hybrid approach.
So for much of Ingenium's collecting history, industrial and technological items came to us when they had more value as a cultural property donation than as an asset to the industry the item served. This often means artifacts were obsolete, broken, or otherwise cast aside by their users or owners, and these factors have a large impact on the conservation future of an artifact. The issues involved with conserving industrial objects differ from other types of collection in 4 fundamental ways. These are size, dissociation, labor knowledge, and changes in worker health and safety. By their nature, industrial artifacts tend to be large and heavy. Storage space and physical accessibility remain highly problematic when caring for large artifacts. They require special handling mechanisms such as forklifts, cranes, and heavy-duty professional movers. The very first limitation on artifact size is determined by what the storage building can accommodate. We are limited by the size of doors, hallways, and in our case, the capacity of our freight elevator. Ingenium has artifacts in the storage building that cannot fit through any door in any of our public-facing museums, creating challenges for how this type of artifact could be interpreted and used. Our most problematic oversized artifact is our Canadair CP-107 Argus II aircraft pictured on the left. It has been left outside of the Canada Aviation and Space Museum storage hangar due to space limitations, and it suffers from extensive large pest ingress, interior mold and humidity damage, structural damage due to repeated seasonal changes without adequate maintenance or protection. It is dying a slow death. When I speak of dissociation of industrial artifacts, I mean the ways in which they are dismantled, partially collected, removed from their environment, or otherwise separated from its operating state in order to be added to a collection. The basic act of transporting industrial technology to our site requires large installed systems be made movable. This means parts are taken off for the purposes of handling without necessarily a thought towards future research. These artifacts are more often than not left in their dismantled state so that storage space can be optimized. This action alienates the object from its original configuration in a way that can be extremely challenging and expensive to overcome. Reassembling complex artifacts requires highly specialized knowledge, equipment, and capacity that the conservation division actively cultivates. We find the specialized knowledge is best held by those who were familiar with the artifacts while they were in operation or use. These are the workers of an industry. However, with certain notable exceptions, the workers of Canada's deindustrialized sectors are largely not present, not able, nor interested in rebuilding lost knowledge that pertains to our most challenging disassociated collections. Records and documentation are vital to the preservation of all collections, but at some point, I need to talk to someone with specific labor experience to tell me where this leftover screw goes and what that button does. These folks can be difficult to connect with, and we are often left to figure it out as best as we can. As Rebecca has described, there's a shift towards collecting stories that actually improves our ability to preserve the artifacts representing those chosen stories. When the most important parts of a technology are collected instead of every single nut and bolt, we can optimize our personnel, time, material, and space to a higher conservation standard. An example of this was recently seen during our collection move in the form of an agriculture incubator that was being prepared for transfer to the new facility. The technologically important parts of the artifact were the 2 wooden incubator boxes, such as the one pictured in the top middle here. However, earlier collecting practices acquired every single part of the system, including over 100 pieces of non-specialized ductwork and piping, such as shown in the middle bottom. The incubator boxes alone could be conserved using 2 pallets, 1 forklift, and 3 person hours. However, all the parts of the system would have required 15 pallets, 1 full day of forklift use, and 80 person hours, and specialized asbestos remediation. The current curator deaccessioned nearly all of the non-specialized parts from this system, focusing on what could be optimally preserved to tell the story of this technology with the resources available. To me, this constituted a conservation improvement. The last challenge I'd like to talk to you about is of particular importance to me as a supervisor of workers in Canada. Just because we are lucky enough to work in a museum environment does not mean we are magically safe from all workplace risks. Ingenium has identified over 30 types of hazards to people and the environment from our artifacts. These range from sharp edges to refrigerants, batteries to fire extinguishers, mercury to cocaine. The Ingenium collection is inordinately, but not surprisingly, more hazardous than other collections in Canada. This is due to the very nature of the scientific, technological, agricultural, and aviation artifacts collected. All of these collections have inherent hazards due to their functions. Artifacts that would get hot during use have asbestos. Artifacts that process crops have pesticides. Artifacts that glow in the dark are radioactive. Our inventory of hazardous artifacts is extensive and I hope exhaustive. And all staff, volunteers, and researchers at Ingenium are trained in and follow our collection risk management program. We take this very seriously, and I'm more than happy to speak offline about our safe work practices to anyone who's curious. The hazards in Ingenium collection are very much a snapshot of the history of occupational safety in Canada. For many reasons, we are the Museum of Work, and conservators contend with the hazards of all workplaces throughout all Canadian industries. We collect drugs and medications that haven't been made in 50 years, so there's no available information on safe handling. We have heavily regulated materials such as polychlorobiphenyls and asbestos. We have materials such as cadmium plating electronics that pose a low risk during its useful life, but deteriorate with age to form toxic oxide products that can be readily inhaled. We have banned substances such as DDT that we're told doesn't exist anymore, so I don't need to worry. Oh, but I wish that were true, yet here are 4 conservators wrapping a DDT-contaminated tiller to prevent cross-contamination during a move. We have learned through experience that just because a substance is internationally recognized as hazardous today does not mean it is identified as such in a deindustrialized collection. Safe work practices are an evolution, and deindustrialized collections capture those hazardous waypoints. However, collecting practices have long overlooked the hazards that sneak in under an artifact skirt, and collecting reawakens these risks, these abandoned dangers that pose to heritage professionals such as myself who work hands-on with unidentified and undocumented hazards. Honest and open discussion of hazardous collections is essential to ensuring a safe and healthy exploration of deindustrialized stories.
I can definitely remember one acquisition deaccession meeting where asbestos was the least hazardous thing on the agenda. And that was a very interesting meeting, a lot of radiation. Anyway, we're going to sort of draw to a close and focus a little bit on one particular artifact, set of artifacts. And so we wanted to give you this particular striking example because this artifact that embodies processes of deindustrialization. This door is from the Dome Mine, now part of Goldcorp Porcupine Gold Mines, and it embodies over 100 years of multi-generational mining history in the Abitibi Gold Belt. The mine operated nearly continuously from 1910 to 2017, and which makes it one of Canada's oldest and most significant gold mines. In addition to its longevity, Dome is important because it figures in many, many multi-generational family stories from the region, and it is often described as the Dome School of Mines because many CEOs and key figures in the Canadian mining industry worked at Dome in some capacity. This door was made in the early years of mining operations, sometime between 1910 and 1915, we believe. It is a site of inscription. We can see marks of the makers. For example, the metal was likely made by a local blacksmith, and the marks of use, there are some dents where the door may have been kicked, possibly in an emergency. The door came to the Ingenium, and of course there are lots of inscriptions, and I'll get to those in a moment, like literal inscriptions, and I'll get to those in a moment. The door came to Ingenium in 2018, about a year after underground mining operations ceased. My colleague and predecessor, Anna Adamek, went down into the mine on the last day where such a trip was possible and chose this and several other artifacts. For example, the mining tag board, you can see a little bit of that in the bottom left photo. It's kind of sticking out outside the door. And she chose a couple pieces for the collection. So much technology and so many stories were left below the surface because it was obviously impossible to save everything. As I mentioned, the door is covered in literal inscriptions left by miners over the century. In addition to facilitating ventilation, which was the doors in the underground, which was the primary function of the door, it gave miners the chance to record their thoughts and sometimes to vent. Topics from noting the first snow of the year to acknowledging topics totally range from acknowledging the first snow to political assassinations. At some point, there were ones like Martin Luther King was murdered today. One was about the marriage of Prince Charles and Princess Diana. I mean, they're very world historical events, and then talking about the first snow or eating bad lunch. Or changing technology at the mine. It's a really fascinating piece. Anyway, we do not know why certain things were inscribed on the door, why certain moments were immortalized. For me, the enmeshment of world historical events in everyday life offers really interesting glimpses into how people experience and share histories. Erin is going to speak about the door from a conservation perspective, and then I'll conclude by sharing some additional thoughts from a curatorial perspective.
Erin, Rebecca, we've probably just got a couple of minutes. Do you
That's
think
fine.
you can? Is that okay? Thank you.
So this door represents a sustainable acquisition from a conservation standpoint. It is of a manageable size and has been placed on a custom-built pallet lined with archivally appropriate supports that you can see in the photo. The supports have been designed to ensure easy movement of access to the relevant parts of the door without requiring additional handling. There is minimal dissociation with this artifact, as it was collected as a door and could be easily separated from the mine without requiring challenging reassembly to be made meaningful. The artifact itself is an example of labor knowledge and experience, and the preservation goal is to keep that representation of the labor. This is straightforward, and we have defined conservation protocols to foster longevity of these features, such as ink and paint and wood. Additionally, the door faces few hazards. Since this was a gold mine, I'm not so worried about asbestos, radioactivity, or other harmful materials unmanageably contaminating surfaces. The trace amounts of mold and pest residues that can be treated without much fuss, and it can safely be made accessible for researchers and the public without the need for specialized protection.
And the door has been relatively accessible to the public, though not on the museum floor since its arrival. And I believe, at least when I left Ingenium for my mat leave, it was still sitting on the floor of the conservation lab. We recently completed a project that attempted to extend the voice of the dome mine door while experimenting with the notion of authenticity versus accuracy. Under the cultivation principle of our collection development strategy and thinking about engaging with artifacts through various art forms, we partnered with a public history graduate class from Carleton University in order to interpret the inscriptions on the door. Each student selected a piece of text and developed a monologue that brought the piece to life. The final result was either audio recorded or filmed, and we put together a video and a blog. It's the link below. I'm sure you can check it out if you want. And there's a video of all the student presentations, and they're really wonderful. Unlike the standard approach to engaging with these inscriptions, the students did not conduct interviews for this project, though of course another project interpreting the inscriptions most certainly could involve interviews. Instead, they researched the context of each specific inscription and connected the text to a situated world context. They also gave voice to the inscriptions, allowing us to imagine the voices of the miners. One even wrote a monologue from the perspective of the door by drawing on material culture analysis in addition to her contextual research. And from a curatorial perspective, this was very interesting beginning to experiment with imaginative, albeit historically authentic voices rather than insist on stringent accuracy. But as we have very few name signatures, this kind of research, performance, and creative interpretation helps us bring the artifact to life. And this kind of interpretation also highlights what we can learn from the almost magical interaction between people and artifacts. Much of the artifact resides in the imagination. Perhaps then interventions like these offer one way of recapturing some of what was lost in the process of collecting comparable projects could be undertaken that feature artifacts about which we know even less than the dome mine door. And to conclude, at Ingenium, we can serve and curate deindustrialization both through the ways in which we care for the artifacts that bear witness to these processes and through how we interpret and engage with artifacts and make them accessible. Partnership, sharing authority, and collaborative creative work are key to our ability to do this work. And we really look forward to thinking about these challenges with all of you throughout the course of the next couple of years. Thanks so much.
Fantastic, thank you both. Okay, so we're going to move straight on to, we can do a virtual round of applause, but we're going to move straight on to the next joint presentation, which is by Esther Bradel and Timo Hauge. I hope I mispronounced your name, Timo, but so you can correct me when you're given the paper.
That's fine.
Thank you. So if you want to set up your PowerPoint, I'll just introduce you both quickly. So Timo is team leader for the industrial culture at the Regionalverband Ruhr, the RVR, and that's the association of cities and districts that make up the Ruhrgebiet. And recently he was a curator responsible for sections on the history of German coal mining at the German Mining Museum in Bochum. And then Esther is also an employee at the Regionalverband Ruhr, and she works for the Department of Industrial Culture and the planning of Geo Information and Spatial Monitoring. So over to you both to give your short presentation. Thank you.
So thank you very much for the introduction. We divided our presentation into two parts. I will just give a short introduction about the structures in the Ruhr area and the RVR's contribution. It's about how many historical sites we have there and how it is constructed all the way. And then Esther will do the main part, and that's about the GIS system that we have at the RVR, and that is a part of the application for industrial heritage with the industrial heritage sites at the Ruhr area. So Esther, could you switch to the next slide, please? Okay, and the next one. Okay. So structure in the Ruhr area. We have a lot of industrial heritage sites at the Ruhr area that are sponsorship by different associations like the Landscape Association, LVL and AVR, or Leibniz Association, or different companies like we have Evonik with a chemical park over there, and different foundations like Krupp Foundation with the Villa Hügel in Essen. Sometimes we have private societies that really run the historical sites, the industrial heritage sites we have over there. But since 1999, every side of this is connected in the Industrial Heritage Trail. That's a superstructure organized by the Regionalverband Ruhr. And the Regionalverband Ruhr is like political administration of the Ruhr area with its own parliament. It's kind of a position between the local politics and the federal state politics, so kind of unique political institution we have over there. It's a planning institution with a 100-year history. And the Industrial Heritage Structural Program, it was founded by the Industrial Heritage Trail. It was a structural program in the 90s to establish the economic sector tourism in the Ruhr area. Right now in 2021, we have 27 anchor points, 17 panoramas, and 13 workers' settlements. They are all combined in this Industrial Heritage Trail. Esther, next slide, please. Yeah. And this is one example of our anchor points. This is the German Mining Museum, where I worked as a curator for the permanent exhibition. The German Mining Museum is mainly sponsored by the Leibniz Association. And as it is sponsored by the Leibniz Association, it's a research museum with scientific departments of mining history, material sciences, and montane archaeology, and has a close connection to the Ruhr University Bochum and the Georg Agricola University of Technology. It has always connection to the Miners Club and connections to private historical societies. So sometimes it's history from below that is represented in the exhibitions. And that's a main part when you talk about the exhibitions and the permanent exhibition, and what makes it a little bit special to be work as a curator at the museum is the huge influence of the RAG, the last hardcore mining company we had at the Ruhr area. They are still a big sponsor for the museum, and so they influence the exhibitions, even the permanent exhibition. And that's definitely kind of a special situation to build exhibitions when you work in the German Mining Museum in Bochum. Esther, please. But you have the RVR there as a superstructure over there, huh? It has different tasks. It is about roads and site signatures that you have with the information about those. You have the regional, national, and the international network. In the regional network, for example, we are responsible for to connect all the historical sites over the year. Twice a year, we have a huge meeting, for example, and we try to represent the Ruhr area in the national network as well and in the international network. As well, we have the so-called RVR contract. This is a huge contract with the 5 biggest sites: Gasometer Oberhausen, Duisburg, North Landscape Park, Hansa Coking Plant, Zollverein Colliery, and Jahrhunderthalle Bochum. That's about 10 million per year that we invest in the maintenance of the 5 biggest sites. And so we have the management position over there. We decide with this in the talks with the sites together what kind of work we do at those sites and how we spend the money over there and what we can do with that. All in all, we can say that 10 million per year is definitely not enough. It's just about the maintenance of the sites. There's no money left then for the development or to sponsor any program over there. Those are different parts that are mostly financed by the money that they get out of the exhibitions and by their sponsors, like I told before. And one of the biggest parts of our work at the RVR in the last years has been the partnership of the application Ruhr Industrial Landscape as UNESCO World Heritage Site. That was the biggest work we did in the last 10 years. And our main task there was to really present or to present here the GIS system and to work as a planning organization with a more than 100-year history. So we have a huge GIS system with maps and all this that helps to archive deindustrialization from 1926 until now. And that's what ISA is presenting right now. For me, it was just this short introduction. Thank you.
Yes, so now for the second part, I will talk about using Geo Information Systems for archiving and presenting deindustrialization. And as Timo already said, with the example of the Ruhr industrial landscape. To connect to Timo's presentation about the Ruhr Regional Association, just some more information. So the RVR is a planning organization with 100 years of tradition. It was founded in 1920 and it, Timo, your microphone is still on.
1921.
Ja, kannst du dein Mikrofon ausmachen? Irgendwie war das gerade störend. Sorry, thank you. So it was founded to create a structural support for the mining industry, and the RVR has legal tasks on the regional level between municipalities and the land of North Rhine-Westphalia. The RVR is it's like a bracket for the Ruhr area, and it has the task to care for the well-being of the Ruhr metropolis, like a networker, coordinator, initiator, provider of services, and project manager. And the employees are experts in regional planning, regional development, in the management of infrastructure projects like the Ruhr Industrial Heritage Trail, Timo already mentioned, and the Emscher Landscape Park. The Ruhr Industrial Landscape, as the RVR, we were a partner at the application for the tentative list to qualify the Ruhr Industrial Landscape as a UNESCO World Heritage. That means not the whole area, but the area was 3% of the whole RVR area. So I will give you a short introduction to this project, just for you to understand how the Ruhr area developed. The Ruhr Industrial Landscape was founded on coal, coke, iron, and steel. These originally separated industries became progressively integrated during the second half of the 19th century, which made the Ruhr region the most productive and influential of all the major industrial regions in continental Europe from the 1850s to the 1960s. Today, innovative technological and architectural ensembles define an outstanding regional scale network industrial landscape, which is characterized by clusters and nodal connections, concentrations like coal mines, coking plants, ironworks, and settlements, associated with linear functional linkages like rivers, canals, and railways. And the area is representative for an industrial system that shaped the region's socioeconomic structure and defined its landscape. And with this application, we wanted to emphasize the historical, but also the ongoing transformation process of the area. Unfortunately, I have to say, in October this year, the application was not passed on to the national level from the land of North Rhine-Westphalia. So nevertheless, I would like to show you our approach on how we defined the nominated landscape using GIS and our historical data. So as already mentioned, we used a GIS application to define our landscape and our nominated property. And in this application, it is possible to display various background information which cover the whole Ruhr area. So for example, we have historical aerial views which cover the whole area. They are dated back till 1926 and are a very good opportunity to show and to see how the landscape developed. So I will zoom into one example because it's better to see if you zoom in the changes. The example is located in the south of Bochum within a green belt, which was part of the nomination of the application. We have a settlement area, the Dahlhauser Heide settlement, a coal mine, the Hannover coal mine, and a polder, and also the iron ore railway. Okay, so first of all, this is a map which is not from the RVR, but of the land of North Rhine-Westphalia, and it is dated back to 1850. It is a topographical map, and you can see that the area was mainly agricultural land, forest, and isolated villages or settlement areas. The next map is also a topographical map dated back to around 1900. And you can see that the Hannover coal mine was already built. It was built around 1850. And there are also railway lines which have been built. The Dahlhauser Heide settlement is not already there. But when we go on to our aerial views, which we have from the RVR, this one is from 1926, and the settlement area is built because the settlement was built in 1907. And I will just go through some historical aerial views. This is 1934. Now is also the iron ore railway was built in 1929, so it's now there. Then it's 1952. And 1969, you can see that a lot of agricultural land disappeared and forest areas were developed. 1990. The Hanover coal mine was closed in 1973. And you can see that there's already buildings that were there before, if I go back, were dismantled, and now there are green areas. And yeah, this is the latest picture of 2020. We also have oblique aerial views. Here's one example of the Hanover coal mine, which was in the example before. And you can access those pictures from every cardinal direction. And another example of the Dahlhauser Heide settlement. So those pictures we also have for the whole area. We also have historical oblique aerial views, but they are not all digitalized yet. So they are not accessible like those pictures from 2020. Yeah, a short summary. So the access to the historical maps and the aerial views have been a huge advantage in the planning process of the World Heritage Application. And they are freely accessible in the shown links. So if you want to have a look at them, you can use those links and you can have access to those views. Yes. That was it. Thank you. And I hope you had a short view into our system.
Thank you, Timo. Thank you, Esther. That was great. Absolutely superb. And I'm sure there's going to be questions and comments later. So again, we're not going to break now for questions and comments. Do put those in the chat if you wish, or save them for when we discuss after the final session. And so moving on, we now have Marcel Wilson. Marcel, do you want to get your PowerPoint ready? Can you hear me okay?
I don't have a PowerPoint.
Oh, you don't have a PowerPoint?
Right,
Oh, sorry.
right.
Okay, so I'll
That's
just very
okay.
quickly introduce you then. Marcel is a site manager for the Youngstown Historical Centre of Industry and Labour, also known as the Steel Museum. And Marcel teaches as part-time faculty in the history department and on women's and gender studies at Youngstown University. No, YSU. Is that Youngstown University?
State. Youngstown
Okay,
State.
Thank you. And she's recently published on the public historian Spark in Memories. I love that title, Spark in Memories, Memory Tourism for a New Audience. And so I'll hand straight over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We opened to the public in 1992. We are part of our state historical organization, the Ohio History Connection. We're also part of Youngstown State University. We joined them in 2010. And faculty such as myself, Dr. Tom Leary, Dr. Brian Bonham, oversee the students and the activities that go on here. We're located about 2 blocks south of our university. And so we're able to work with students, the community, and business to continue to preserve and perpetuate our history and memory in the area. We collect history, we do industrial, ethnic, cultural, and labor history from the area. And our history goes back at least to the founding of the state in around 1803. with the development of stone stack furnaces that are extant in the area in a couple of places. And we have one of, I think it's 6 in the state, archives that are attached to our museum that collect state and local government records. We work a lot with students. Majority of the people who are in charge of daily activities are students who are being supervised. We have master's level interns as well as undergraduates who work with us on a variety of different things. What's really interesting is our ability to allow students to do hands-on history in a public realm that will be seen by audiences from the Tri-County area as well as around the country and around the world. We began, planning for the museum began in the 1970s. What happened was a majority of our steel mills in the area suddenly closed on September 19th of 1977. We refer to that locally as Black Monday. And one of our local senators, Marcelle, had been a former steel worker. And so he wanted to preserve the memory. It was a very bitter time because it was devastating to the local economy and the local workers in the area. It caused our population to decline significantly. And it led to further closing of mills as time progressed. We've had mills closing as late as 2012. But the real start date is initiated at around 1977. Senator Marcelle wanted to be able to preserve our history and create historical tourism of the area and kind of have a way to showcase our contributions to the community and to the country. By the 1950s, we were producing about, we were the 5th largest steel producer in the United States. And our contributions to a variety of different industries are significant. Most of the items I noticed in the first presentation, they mentioned that most of their items are not in working order. Most of ours actually are. As the mills closed, people donated items to us, and most of our items, we could actually go and start producing steel or utilizing them at any point in time. We try to preserve the past as well as highlight the diversity of the economy as it's changing over time in our area. We have a lot of 3D manufacturing and business incubators here in the area now. And so that change has been significant, but it helps us tell the story of how we've evolved over time. We primarily, steel and iron production began here because of the natural resources that were available, and they attracted a great deal of immigration and migration of people from around the world as well as from the South. And that helps to contribute to the cultural and ethnic history that we like to highlight, as well as the industrial history here. Our collections are varied. One of our largest one is a blooming mill pulpit, which weighs about 20 tons. That's our largest artifact. We have a variety of different things, 3-dimensional as well as 2-dimensional. Our archives library has a plethora of blueprints, maps, photographs, personal records. And what we're working on now is collaboration with other local steel heritage sites in our region so that we can promote and cross-promote our various areas of interest and help to encourage people to come to the area and recognize our past as well as our contributions to the future. I think that's about all I wanted to talk about today. It's we're a relatively small organization within a larger state organization. Our ties with the community and with the university are very important to us and help us to contribute and work on a daily basis to commemorate the history and perpetuate moving forward.
Fantastic, thank you so much. That was really interesting, personally interesting, because I've been working on the steel industry over here as well, and its various forms of heritage and memorialization. So I'd love to have a chat with you one day, but thank you. So again, we're going to move on now to the last talk we have today, which is Stefano Agnoletto, who I believe does have a PowerPoint. So if Stefano, you want to get that ready, and I'll just quickly introduce you. So Stefano is a visiting research fellow at BI Norwegian Business School in Oslo in Norway. And until 2018, he was head of the Department of Didactics at the Institute for the History of a Contemporary Age in Milan in Italy. He's got such a wide range of interests. His research topics encompass economic and social history, labour and business history, migration history, history education, and industrial heritage. And so he's here to wrap up the session for us today. So over to you, Stefano.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to share. Okay.
That's it. You just want to. Oh, that's it. Perfect. Okay, I'll mute myself.
Okay. Well, yeah, I'm going to speak about, oh, thank you, first of all, Hilary. And I'm going to speak about the experience of ISEC Foundation, that is the Institute for the History of Contemporary Age. It is an Italian institution based in Sesto San Giovanni, that it's a city close to Milano. Well, what is ISEC, Fondazione ISEC? It's basically an archive, a library, and a didactic department. ISEC conserve an impressive archive and book heritage. We have more than 5,000 meters of documents, photographs, technical drawings, political manifestos, oral sources, books, newspaper, and so on. Here you can see some pictures that came from our archive. Okay, in particular, Fondazione ISEC is an institution specialized in Italian industrial history, combining both labor and business history approach. It is focused on the protection and dissemination of a vast archival heritage coming from large as well as medium or small Italian companies, trade unions, and also private and formal archive belonged to former workers, entrepreneurs, labor and business historians, researchers, trade unions activists, and so on. It's interesting to highlight where Fondazione ISEC is based. It is based in Sesto San Giovanni, that was one of the most important industrial hubs in the 20th century Italy. Why? Because this city, Sesto San Giovanni, it's a middle-sized city located in a strategic position within the metropolitan area of Milano, just on the north, as you can see on the map. So at the beginning of the 20th century, several industries moved to Sesto San Giovanni, and it became the fifth industrial center in Italy. Then at the end of the 20th century, especially in the decades of the 80s and the 90s, the industrialization process was particularly quick and tough, and all the big businesses that had created the industrial history of Sesto shut down. So we can say that Fondazione ISEC combines both the collection and enhancement of the local memory of this industrial hub and of the industrialization process that have characterized it in recent decades. And also, Fondazione ISEC became one of the most important places of collection, conservation, and research on national Italian industrial history. What is our approach? What we try to do? Basically, we try to overcome a conservative vision of industrial heritage in favor of what we call a dynamic open culture vision, means a vision of historical culture and historical heritage as a public good. Our aim is the transformation of industrial heritage into a community. And in order to make our archive a space for social aggregation, and especially for younger generation that are growing up in times and spaces of post-industrialization. Some example in order to explain how we try to work. For example, the activities of the didactic department at Fondazione ISEC. This department has many tasks, but in particular, it's devoted to supervising and training school teachers, implementing interactive workshops for students who come from elementary school to high school and also university, and planning new high-quality curriculum and innovative teaching methods in history education. So our teaching and educational strategy as an archive are based on collaboration between three actors: the schools, Veritas sector, and the historians, both academic and non-academic. So we propose many kinds of activities. Some example, classical guided working team, small group on archival sources, or guided visits to local site of industrial heritage, as well as, of course, frontal lecture. And for example, during these lessons, students are also asked if they want to physically touch the archival sources using gloves and precaution, like we like to say like real archivists do. Clearly, we also organize meetings with students and former workers, trade unions representative, employers, and it's interesting. At the end of the programs with every school, many classes would set up exhibition in the premise of Villa Milius. Villa Milius is the headquarters of ISEC Foundation, and it's a very nice 18th century villa. And the students present the result of their researches on issues related to sources available at our archive or to a local site of industrial heritage, its history, or its use or possible use in this time of the industrialization, it means today. Alongside this project with students, we also worked with school teachers on industrial history and industrialization. Training courses for school teachers combine different didactic modalities, such as lectures, workshops in archive, interview with the protagonists of the local and national industrial histories, movies, visit to factories or to industrial archaeological sites, and so on. Clearly, as I told earlier, Fondazione ISEC is not just the didactic department. Every year, hundreds of activities are held at ISEC to enhance the archival heritage. It means production of oral sources, production of video and films based on the sources available at our archive, publishing of books presentation for archival collection, public interviews with protagonists of the local or national industrial history, organization of exhibition, visits to archive, obviously also academic seminars. Here you have some example that, for example, you can find online this movie here on the left. The title is in Italian is Polli nella ruggine. in English means pollen rust. You can find it with English undertitle, and it is about the history of the last period of the life of Falk and all the conflict that came out in time of the industrialization. What is interesting of this movie, that is an example of how we used to work. For example, we made this big fundraising together with the former workers of the companies in order to produce the kind of movie. Some remarks on our experience. We defined our attempt an experimental process to put the history of industrialization and deindustrialization together to work. In particular, we aim to understand how it's possible to valorize the knowledge achieved by the community of experts, such as historians, archivists, activists, researchers, and so on industrial heritage from a perspective of public history and history education in school. It means practically, how can we open our archive and make it really a place, an open place where the people can be active actor in employing it and what there is they can find in this archive. We are also aware that the citizens do not enter in the archives as blank states or as empty hands. It means that industrial heritage also should mean helping citizens to be able to recognize that industrial history is also an history of conflict, as well as an history of conflictual memories. And this is very true, for example, in a place like Sesto San Giovanni. You know, the name of Sesto San Giovanni in the 20th century was the Stalingrad of Italy. So you can understand what kind of conflict it means for the people who used to work in the companies and factories in Sesto San Giovanni in the 20th century. So we think that citizens and protagonists had the right to find their history and their conflicts recognized when we use the industrial heritage. So what kind of look about the industrial past we try to propose to the people? We want, in particular, the activities proposed by Fondazione ISEC do not aim to propose an accepted description of industrialization, nor to hide the process and conflict that have pervaded the history of industrialization. Our point is social and class conflicts, as well as environmental and gender-related conflict, are a fundamental part of the memory of industrialization and deindustrialization that the participants to our activity have to deal with. And this is true both when we build the industrial heritage, I mean, when we build our archive, and also when we open it to the people. That's all. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Stefano. I've certainly got questions now. So that wraps up the presentations today. Please join me in thanking all of the speakers. I'm just going to go and virtually clap. And so, yeah, that was very, very rich indeed. And we have, if we're finishing at 5 o'clock in the UK, I don't know what time it would be in Canada, but in another, just under an hour, then we have plenty of time for questions and discussion. So the way I think I'm going to do this is, I see some people putting up hands, but go into the chat. Quite early on, Stephen, hi, put a couple of questions or comments in the chat box. So I think I'm going to go to Stephen first. Unfortunately, the speakers of the first paper have both had to leave. Rebecca and Erin have both had to leave, so they're no longer with us. So bear that in mind if you're asking questions. They're not here anymore. So Stephen, is there anything that you wanted to say to kick us off, please?
Well, I had a lot of questions. Really great presentations, and it's got me thinking a lot about what the difference is between curating industrial heritage and curating deindustrialization, right? So what does that do when you shift that frame? And certainly with the first two presentations, I got a real sharp sense of the differences between curating, a ruined site and in location, in place, versus curating objects, right, that are brought together from a far afield, right? And so what does that do in terms of, politically, but also in terms of what the curatorial possibilities are? And then with the last two, I was thinking about, these are two, wonderful initiatives that are really grounded in, a locality, right? A deindustrialized locality. And of course, they're bound up in these processes in a very direct way. And so I was thinking, what does that do? Yeah, proximity, right, versus distance. And you get a sense of various proximities and distances here with these four. Yeah, so that's a bunch of ideas, I guess. I'm not sure if that's a question that you wanted me to ask, Hilary.
Well, I guess I could say, do any of the speakers want to respond to Stephen's point, or should we just leave that hanging luxuriantly in the air? If you do want to respond, that we'll just leave it hanging in the air. So Stefan Berger and Stefan Moisha have their hands up. I think Stefan put his hand. Stefan Berger.
Hi, yes, thanks very much, Hilary. And thanks to all the presenters. I entirely agree with Stephen. Fantastic session. And sort of starting really from the last presentation by Stefano, I was struck with the explicit attempt to kind of build what perhaps can be inadequately described as post-industrial communities with the archives of an industrial past. And I wonder how that works. And because in a way, we have these changing communities where work has changed often fundamentally. We have not the kind of industrial work that we associate with steel mills and mines. We have often far more precarious work. We have a weakening of trade union organizations. We have different kind of loyalties. I mean, if we consider a place like Sesto San Giovanni, we realize that this once was a sort of bulwark of the Partito Comunista Italiano, and now is kind of a sort of bulwark of right-wing populism. So we have a kind of changing politics in these places. I mean, I find it a fascinating idea to try and use the archives of the industrial past in order to build post-industrial communities. And the work that you do with school teachers, with the heritage sector, would be one way of, in a way, trying to work with the memories and the values of an industrial past against the grain, so to speak, of where the politics of places like Sesto are moving. I just wondered whether I could ask you for a bit of a reflection of how much of an uphill battle you think that might be in the context of the changing landscapes of deindustrialization. And if we move that kind of one step further, and if we compare it to what we've heard about the Ruhr, and sort of addressing Timo and Esther here, we clearly have a very different scenario. We have a sort of state machinery, this, the state, not just as the nation state, but as the regional, the federal state, and organizations like the Regionalverband Ruhr, which have quite a bit of funds and quite a bit of power to direct heritageization. You could say very much from above. You do have also companies and foundations, most notably the RAG Foundation, and you talked about the importance of the RAG foundations in constructing the memory of the industrial past, in the Ruhr in particular, the mining past. We have a kind of a completely different scenario where we have from above a lot of interest in constructing the past, and that kind of construction of the past, which is so well funded in the Ruhr, creates this kind of gigantic landscape of heritageization, which is used, I say, also to build post-industrial futures. You know, like Stefano's idea to build post-industrial communities with the archives of the industrial past, we have in the Ruhr also the attempt to use the industrial past to build a kind of post-industrial futures, but much more directed, much more generously funded by a mixture of the political establishment and the industrial establishment. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how you assess the role of industry in this. To put it maybe a bit provocatively, could we say that a kind of well-embedded capitalism in West Germany, a capitalism that has a kind of social conscience, is actually using industrial heritage to create a kind of post-industrial future in a kind of social democratic image? So, sorry, my main questions were to Stefano and to Timo and Esther. Thank you.
So I don't know. I mean, Stefano, Timo, and Esther, do you want to? Would any of you like to?
Do I reply now or later?
Yeah, reply now, by all means.
Okay, I try. I try. First of all, thank you very much to everyone is here today, and thank you to Stefano, to Stefan and Stephen. Here I'm Stefano, Stephen, and Stefan. It's quite difficult. Okay, and I try to reply, to answer, and I try to connect Stephen and Stefan ideas, because clearly proximity, yeah, it's a key word here for us, because ISEC is based in Sesto San Giovanni. And Sesto San Giovanni was the Stalingrad of Italy, was a very big industrial hub, and today it is not. And this is very important, yeah. And I think, Stefan, you perfectly understood our problem, how to manage the industrial heritage, the industrial past, the industrial memory in a place such as Sesto San Giovanni, that it was a paradigmatic example of industrial hub that, as we all well know, is not just means economical, or but means social policy, cultural issue, many other stuff. Sesto San Giovanni was a very important hub also for the worker movement, okay, and for the Communist Party. Between the 1945 and the 1985, the Communist Party used to take more than 50% of the votes in Sesto San Giovanni. So you can understand what was the situation. And it's true, now the municipality of Sesto San Giovanni is led by the far right, Lega Nord, and so on. This is an incredible change. So what's the problem? Here is a typical example of what kind of relation has a community with its industrial past. And probably the difference with the Ruhr is that if I have understood well what I know, in the Ruhr there is this policy of valorization of the industrial past. Instead, in San Giovanni, the problem is that there is an, how can I say in English, there is, the problem is that the industrial past is seen as the history of a part of a society. You understand what you mean? And it was the history of a period where there was a part of a society that was able to be hegemonic. Nowadays, another part, not just politically, but culturally, another part of the society has the hegemony. So, for example, as ISEC, we have this problem. How we manage a situation where to be, the representative of industrial past put us in a situation, in a conflictual role in itself with not just with political power, but with the subject that must give us the money. And so the situation is very, very complicated. And there is this strange relation between the conflict of the past and the conflict of the present. Secondly, the community. Here we have another problem, because there is a problem of the past identity of the community and the present identity of the community that is different, not just generationally, another generation, but for example, now Sesto San Giovanni is a place of immigration from out of Italy. People who are not part of that history. And this is really complicated to manage this. For example, when we work with the students, it's clear they are the students, they had the grandparents who worked in the factories, and there are students who are grandparents, not grandparents, but also parents coming from Africa, Asia, or the part of Europe. So this is very difficult to manage and to understand this situation. And this is, so I think it's very complicated when you decide that you don't want just to be a place of a memory for that specific place, but for the memory of what industrialization means. This is why, as Fondazione ISEC, we decided to connect ourselves to both the local experience, but also to the national/international experience, in order to try to make the meeting with our archive as an experience that can be understood from all the people who come to us, not just as a scientific or cultural experience, but as something related to their history, their family history. And I don't know if I am able to explain this, but clearly in few minutes, quite difficult. But I have to say that Stefan, you really got what's the problem and what we try to do here.
Okay, thanks, Stefano. I'm conscious that Stefan Moitra has had his hand up for quite a long time. It must be aching by now. So unless Esther and Timo have something they want to quickly respond to on that last thread, okay, can we move over to Stefan Moitra? Okay.
Quickly response to it is just when you talk about the relationship between companies and the active industry and industrial heritage, it's kind of curse and blessing at the same time. And when it's about curating industrial heritage, then the influence of the companies is they try to shape the narrative, and then it's not really easy to curate it in a critical way. And to really go deep into topics that maybe that maybe don't have a positive image for the companies and all that stuff. That's maybe a problem when you talk about curating industrial heritage. It's a different point of view, for example, when you talk about the funding. You know, without the funding of those companies, a lot of things are not possible. I think the role of companies and of active industry should be different when you talk about industrial heritage. In my opinion, it is really important to make the connection between the historical sites and between the history and the museums of industrial heritage and the active industry you have right now as well. Because the importance of industrial processes in the past, right now and in the future, is one of the biggest and one of the most important tasks of industrial heritage, I think. And so on, when you talk about the role of active industry and of the companies, they have to be part of those exhibitions. They have to be a part of what industrial heritage tells to the people. And it's really important, in my opinion, for the image of a region and all that stuff. When you have, for example, like in the Ruhr area, when we had the UNESCO World Heritage Application here, it was a huge political discussion if the industrial heritage here at the Ruhr is just a musealization of the region, and it just takes a look in the past and is maybe a problem for the well-being of this region in the future. And I think it must be a different position. You have to work together with active industry and companies just to show how dynamic and how important in industry and industrial processes are still in the region and still for the future. Just as a quick response.
Thank you, Timo. Stefano, you've still got your hand up, by the way. Just let you know. Oh, it's down now. Okay, so Stefan Moitra, go for it.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks for really interesting presentations. And I mean, I think a lot has been said already that I was going to ask, but I want to come back to one point that Stephen was making in his little summary in the beginning. And that concerns probably temporalities and also temporalities of objects. And if we think about, and I'm sitting here as a representative of a museum, so if we think about curating and collecting objects and of the material culture and memory of deindustrialization, from all the presentations that I've heard today, I get the image that, and I can sort of relate to that from my museum at the German Mining Museum in Bochum, that what industrial museums and industrial heritage sites usually do is look at the industrial parts at large, sort of. In contrast to really looking at that which has come after. And we are actually, like, I think that the task for us is probably, or from my point of view, is to ask ourselves, how do we represent, even in terms of objects and material culture, how do we represent deindustrialization, or the process of deindustrialization and post-industry, or whatever you want to call it. Even from the Ruhr perspective, in Esther's and Timo's presentation today, we have like the very large approach. Even from Marcelle Wilson's paper on Youngstown, Ohio, she said that, okay, so we want to represent our past for a potential future and have this proper representation of our contribution to the national narrative, to the national past. So, but this is also always relating to the industrial past. But my question to all the presenters would be, what do you think, which kind of objects would we have to go to probably present the process after industry has gone? So not always just relating or always presenting like the big machinery, the big technology, and so on, or maybe the labor movement and the struggles of the labor movement, but how do we approach, well, what has come after?
Sorry, I was excitedly, yeah, go for it.
when I can respond, it's in my opinion, it's always when you talk about curating it and showing it, it's always about the process of the transformation. It's an ongoing transformation progress to show. And when you talk about objects then and to represent this process in a museum, there is not the one answer. It depends on what is becoming, what's coming the next thing in different regions after the industrialization or after the industry is gone. When we talk about the Ruhr area, for example, there are a lot of different cities that try to build their new narrative. When you talk about Bochum, for example, you talk about IT security, for example, and all this stuff, and you talk about the narrative afterwards, or the what kind of region can I do as well? There are different parts of it, but it's always a transformation process, and that is really not easy to show in a museum or to materialize it. It's always special to the situation.
Any other comments on Stefan's very interesting question? I think you're absolutely right, by the way. A museum of deindustrialization, does it exist as its own entity? Could it exist as its own entity? I can't tell who's speaking. Is that somebody putting their hand up? Okay. So the floor is open again, and Stefan Berger has got his hand up. Stefan, please.
Well, I was wondering whether a museum of deindustrialization would be a bit like the attempts that we have during communism to create museums of atheism. In the sense they would be, you know, like the museums of atheism depicted religion, the museums of deindustrialization would depict industrial societies. And probably the transition to something else, as the museums of atheism depicted the transition from alleged superstition to the rational paradise of the communist enlightenment. In that sense, I think we already have in a number of places museums of deindustrialization, only they're not called this. Yeah, that was just a direction, I think, to the last comment. But maybe as I'm speaking, I can challenge Timo a little bit more too, because Timo, I know that you were directly involved in curating sections of the German Mining Museum when it was redone, and you do refer to the finances by the IAC Foundation being a curse and a blessing. So could you perhaps give an example of where you see this kind of direct influence of the IAC Foundation on curating the history of the mining past? Because certainly, you know, I'm more concerned with research, and I get a lot of money from places like the IAC Foundation for doing research, but I've never found that they take a direct influence, although I've often wondered whether there are limits to that. So I'd be keen to know, you know, where you would have curated things differently, and the IAC Foundation told you, you can't do it like this, you have to do it like this.
Yeah, thank you, Stefan, for the question. There are different parts of the exhibition. It's when you talk about topics like ecology, for example, what have been the problems with hard coal mining? What has it done to the ecology in the area, for example? They more or less ask you to present it as a story where they just did their best, and they are kind of preservers of the ecology at the end of the day, more or less. So, for example, or there's always a discussion here in the Ruhr area, for example, if it was really the best decision to have the hardcore mining until 2018, or if it would have been better just to end it before, just whenever, forever, and how much money has been spent to get the hardcore mining running until 2018. And that was critical positions on this or that haven't been allowed, for example. And this would have been discussion in the museum, for example, would, in my opinion, would have been really great to have the museum as a forum for all the people who go there, for example. So those are maybe the two biggest problems, for example.
Okay, thank you, Timo. Jana. Hi, Jana. Jana, do you have your hand up?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Thank you.
Sorry, problem with the sound. I'm sorry for the background noise because we're sitting in a hotel lobby, so maybe there are also some connection problems. But I wanted to add from the point of view of one of the industrial museums in the Ruhr region, and because it was founded at the same time as the Steel Museum in Youngstown, like in the 70s or end of the 70s, and I had this social history approach. And I saw your comment, Hilary, on how protest can be like this link between industrial, talking about industrial history and deindustrialization. And I think there are a lot of objects which actually show the history of deindustrialization as well. And I think at the Industrial Museum, we also work with this sense of layers, that to show where history repeats itself, so that you don't see it as disconnected from the present, that something happened in the past and that's over and done with, but something that always repeats itself and where it repeats itself in the present time. So when we did an exhibition for the end of coal mining, we showed how people were engaged in different initiatives to, of course, save industrial heritage, but also put it to a different use and have this critical approach to industrial heritage, and how people were evicted from places where they lived and how that goes on today, and how people are involved in the Ruhr area and in processes of decision making and stuff like that. So if you show these different layers, and how history repeats itself, I think there are a lot of objects that can tell the story. And we're just, my colleague Nikolai is sitting here as well, because we were at the conference, or like this internal museum conference, where we were talking about where we want to go with the museum and which are the topics we want to connect to and how we stay relevant. And of course, that are the different topics of ecology and capitalism and the influences all this has. And if we want to stay relevant, we of course don't only talk about industrial history and what happened in the past and how then deindustrialization happened, as it sometimes is talked about. Of course, it didn't just happen, and it was something that wasn't avoidable. So we show what are the problems today and how they connect to the past and how they are directly linked, and you can never have this separate view. Yeah, maybe that's my short answer to that.
No, thank you. I completely agree. And also, of course, the big topic at the moment of climate change and how that links to industrialization. But anyway, moving on to Lauren. So Lauren, you got a...
Yeah, I just had a question for Marcel specifically, because Marcel, I know that, in addition to your curatorial work on the, steel history of Youngstown, you also do work on histories of healthcare and nursing. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to the way that a museum that is, colloquially referred to as the Steel Museum deals with other more feminized labor histories that are changing, and in a lot of deindustrialized areas are actually rising, right, to kind of quote unquote fill the void of lost industrial labor. So I'm wondering, Marcel, if you could just speak a little bit to your work on the history of nursing in conversation with the Steel Museum.
Yes, we recently acquired a nice collection of items from the Youngstown General Duty Nurses Association, which was the first union of nurses in Ohio and the second in the country. And we were tasked with not only cataloging and organizing their collection, but also creating an exhibit for it. And the result of that came the Youngstown General Duty Nurses Association a legacy of dignity, caring, and service. And as a result, we examined not only what the women were going through from a labor standpoint, also nurses in general, working conditions. We also noticed that because the nurses lived in this area and we have a strong union background and history of union membership, that was one of the first ways that they looked at solving some of their labor related problems was joining one of the unions. They eventually joined a professional union because they wanted it to represent not only their skill as nurses, but also the hard work that they do. And they were able over time to create a labor contract, which is an example and kind of a template for nurses contracts all over the country. So they have a really unique history. They follow a lot of what some of the other unions do, but gender plays a definite role in it, as well as the type of work they're doing. And some of the other hospitals in our area, because we had several, some didn't have unions for the nurses, others had unions, but they were for other staff. And the differences in their wages, their outcome, their labor conditions was really significant. Does that kind of address what you asked?
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, there's quite a few comments coming into the chat box. Have I ignored anybody that's put anything in the chat box that they wanted to bring up? If so, please put your hand up. But just looking through. David Omos, I don't know if do you want to say something about your ideas that you're pursuing in the UK with Walking the Seam, please?
Can you hear me now? Yeah, Hilary?
Yeah. Yes.
We took Dr. Michelle Allen up the northeast about probably about 6 or 7 years ago. We talked with the idea. We was working in the former coalfield regions about the idea that you got where we live is famous for being Sherwood Forest and Robin Hood. So you've got the forest above, but you also had the forest underground as well. So the idea came out about walking the seam. And then from that, we developed that there's endless stories of mining folklore, which is connected to the arts and heritage and culture. And the idea was that you could create a number of digital trails and access them via app, while you actually are on site at these places. Inevitably, a lot of them are country parks now. Other ones is light industry, but there's bits of remains of mining memorials and statues left, but you'd connect these memorials and the current country parks up and actually get to various sites and tell the stories as you walk around. That's the idea.
Thank you, David. I know that Jonah's got a question, but can I just ask Marcel something that actually segues into what David has just said? So Marcel, I'm interested in the way that steel is commemorated both within official museums, but also how it's memorialized differently outside of museums. So, because I'm always aware that industrial heritage, can be something like can be very temporary, very ephemeral. It can be in private collections, it can be a statue, it can be a plaque, etc., etc. So I just wondered if you could say something about the situation where you are with steel and the various ways it's been memorialized and who by.
Certainly, it's been memorialized in our area in quite a variety of different ways. We're not the only heritage or steel museum in the area. We have some dedicated to railroad and railroad workers. We have another one that collects very large artifacts that we can't accept. And then we have other organizations that do local cultural and ethnic backgrounds of the steel workers. But we have a variety of different ways. I know here at the museum, we have several sculptures that were done in steel, and they reflect not only the steel workers, but the integrity and the work ethic. The most recent one that we have is from Rabbi Sidney Rakoff. He was a steel worker here in Youngstown. Then he owned a furniture store. He was a World War II veteran, and he eventually became a rabbi who created steel sculptures in his retirement. And they reflected all of his unique experiences, and those experiences in turn reflect often what steel workers, people in industry, labor, considered to be very important themes: hard work, sacrifice, thinking of the other, ideals of safety, ideals of camaraderie. And so we find throughout our region that there are a great deal of statues put up, and they represent hard work and contributions to the community. We have worker housing that is, some of it is being rehabbed, some of it is being utilized, and we're hoping to see some of that turned into another aspect of some tourism, that we can take people around to see where these people lived, how close they were to the mills, how they made their way to work every day. So we have a variety of different ways that we see the heritage being represented. We, in our outskirts, we have a mall in Boardman, Ohio, and they're revamping, and they've painted a quote about cities from steel don't crumble. If you go into local restaurants, you'll often see images from the mills, either painted or being reproduced through photography. And just the names of things here too. We have a lot of things that are colloquially named because of the steel industry. And one specifically is our local newspaper on campus is called the Jam Bar, which is in reference to a tool that was used in the mills.
Okay, thank you very much. So I mustn't leave Jonah waiting any longer, so he's been putting lots of questions in the chat about architecture. So Jonah, do you want to, I don't know if you've got your camera on, do you want to put your camera on or leave it off, but unmute yourself and say what it is that's interesting you about architecture in particular in connection with this afternoon's or this morning's or this evening's discussion? Jonah Curtis, are you there? Maybe you can't hear me because I think my internet connection's been a bit flaky. Okay, well, we can always come back to that. Does anybody else want to put their hand up and ask any other questions or go back to previous discussion? Okay, well, Lauren, Stephen, should we wrap up? I think so. Okay, it's been, well, I know some of the speakers have sadly had to leave a bit early because of other commitments, but it's been extremely enlightening, and now I'm definitely going to go away and think about this concept of a deindustrialized museum, or the museum of deindustrialization, and think about what shapes and colors that might form, and ponder on that a bit conceptually as well. But thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to everybody that's come along today. And I don't know if there's anything else, Stephen or Lauren, that you want to flag up in terms of future depot events before we all say goodbye and sign off.
Well, there's a couple. In January, we'll be having the next sort of roundtable on France. We're going to be zooming in on France, and it's an area that's that's undergoing a lot of scholarship right now. There's a really vibrant moment, I think, in terms of people thinking about deindustrialization and what it means and so on, and whether it's the mining basin of the north or Lorraine or other places. And then, of course, in May, we're having a conference in Bochum, and so the RVR and the Mining Museum and all the other partners in the Ruhr are hosting the water project. And of course, you know, the conference is open to anyone. So if other people who are not part of Depot are interested in going, there's certainly possibilities for that. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
Okay, then please join me in thanking everybody that's either presented or contributed to questions and discussion today. And I wish you all a very nice rest of your day and evening. And please come back to the next Depot event, whatever that will be in the future. So thank you all and goodbye.